On Friday, April 17th, 1993, 59-year-old millionaire Dale Ewell was flying his Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine airplane thousands of feet above Fresno, California. Dale was a handsome man with blue eyes and dark hair that was starting to turn gray. He was flying his plane from where he lived in Fresno to a small airport about 45 minutes away because he was going to meet his wife and kids at the family's beach house for Easter weekend. In the cockpit, Dale looked out at the clear blue sky and listened to the hum of the plane's engine, and suddenly any stress he might have been dealing with just kind of disappeared. Airplanes had been a huge part of Dale's life for almost 40 years, and he never felt better than when he was flying. In the 1950s, Dale had flown twin-engine turboprop planes as a member of the United States Air Force, and then after he left the military, Dale had gotten a job selling small airplanes to private pilots and California ranchers for a company owned by a man named Frank Lamb. Frank had taken Dale under his wing and taught him everything he could about the airplane industry, and Dale had turned out to be a very gifted airplane salesman. Part of Dale's skill as a salesman was that he was very charming and he felt comfortable talking to all kinds of people, but really the main reason Dale had been so successful at selling planes was because his love of being a pilot really rubbed off on people. And when he talked to potential clients about the peace and the awe he felt when he was flying, they wanted to experience the same thing. And so Dale had quickly moved up the company ladder, and when Frank had stepped away from the business 20 years earlier, Dale had taken over and become the owner and president of the company. Once Dale was in charge, he had started making a lot of money, and he invested that money really well. So in 1992, as Dale approached his 60th birthday, he was worth about $8 million, which would be over $17 million in 2023. When Dale got to be about 20 miles away from the airport where he was going, he radioed air traffic control and got clearance to make his final approach. Dale descended to an altitude of about 2,000 feet and then started the landing procedure. And when he touched down on the runway, he was already looking forward to flying again in a couple of days. But first, he was eager to spend some time relaxing with his family. Dale got into a car that he had arranged to have waiting for him at the airport, and then he drove a few miles to Pajaro Dunes, a small upscale beachfront community in Northern California. He made his way down a secluded street, past large homes that looked out onto the Pacific Ocean, and then finally he pulled up to his own beach house, he parked his car, and stepped outside. His wife, Glee, and his daughter, Tiffany, were sitting on the porch waiting for him. Glee and Tiffany had driven to the beach house together the day before. Glee, who had short brown hair and a big smile, stood up and kissed her husband when he stepped onto the porch. Glee and Dale had been married for 31 years, and when they had started making a lot of money, Glee had really committed herself to community service and philanthropy. And so as a result, back in Fresno where they lived, Glee was admired as a community leader. But Glee had a past that most people in Fresno didn't know anything about. She was extremely smart and she had a talent for speaking foreign languages. And in the late 1950s, before she and Dale had gotten married, Glee's skills had landed her a job in South America as a translator for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is a federal agency in the United States that specializes in foreign intelligence. Glee's children thought it was exciting that their mom had once worked for the CIA, but Glee thought about her time in South America like it was from a different life. On the porch, Glee and Dale's daughter, Tiffany, got up and hugged her dad. Then she opened the door, and they all went inside the beach house. Tiffany was 24 years old, with cropped blonde hair and a smile that was almost identical to her mother's. She was quiet and reserved around people she didn't know, and in fact, she'd been named the shyest person in class when she was in college. But Tiffany's family and her few close friends knew she was funny and sweet and a great person to talk to once she'd let her guard down. So Dale, Glee, and Tiffany spent a lot of that day just talking to each other, and their main topic of conversation was the youngest member of the family, Dana, and his new girlfriend, Monica Zent. The two had met at their dorm at Santa Clara University, which was a little over an hour from the beach house. And the next day, Dana was supposed to bring Monica out to the beach house to meet the rest of his family. The following morning, 20-year-old Dana Ewell pulled up to the front of the beach house in his gold Mercedes-Benz, and he, along with his girlfriend, Monica, got out of the car and walked towards the front door. Dana was tall and thin with dark brown hair, and this day he wore a t-shirt and jeans. But that outfit was actually kind of unusual for him. Most of the time, when Dana went anywhere, even to his college classes, he wore a tailored Armani suit, which is very fancy. Dana looked up to his father, and he really wanted to be successful like his dad was, and so he thought it was important to dress the part. Dana and Monica walked inside the beach house, and Dana right away called out for his parents. Monica looked around the large front room and listened to the sound of the ocean just outside, and she was kind of in shock. Monica's father was an FBI agent, so she had not grown up around people who had as much money as Dana and his family. So the gold Mercedes, the beachfront property, the airplanes, and the whole lifestyle the Ewells led was just all so new to her. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany came into the front room from the kitchen and said hello to Dana and Monica. Then Glee asked Monica to go on a tour of the beach house, really just so Glee could get to know her son's new girlfriend a little bit better. And later that day, while Monica was spending time with Glee and also with Tiffany, Dana and Dale went to play tennis on a court that was reserved just for residents of this small beach community. As they played, Dale talked to his son about the airplane business, but he really wanted to hear about how Dana was doing at school. Dana said classes were going great and that he really liked his girlfriend, Monica, so he was excited that the family was finally getting to meet her. Dana also said that he really hoped the entire family would get to spend more time together as a whole once this semester was over. And then the two of them started talking about their favorite topic, flying. Dana said that he wanted to get into piloting helicopters, so his dad, Dale, said they should find a good place for him to take lessons that was not too far from school. They played tennis for a bit longer, and then they headed back to the beach house. Later that night, a few hours after dinner, Dale and his wife Glee were lying in bed, and they began talking about how lucky they were to have this beach house, this really nice place where the whole family could go and spend time together and just kind of be away from everything for a little while. Glee said that she knew the kids were growing up and they had their own lives and interests, but she just hoped that Dana and Tiffany would keep coming to the beach house even when they were older and had families of their own. On April 19th, the following day, Dale helped his wife and his daughter load up Glee's gray Cadillac with the suitcases and cooler of food that they had brought to the beach. Dana and Monica were going to have Easter dinner with Monica's parents, so they had already left. Once Glee's car was loaded, Dale gave his wife and his daughter a kiss and told them he'd see them when he got home. Then Dale got into his own car and drove to the airport so he could fly his plane back to Fresno. Tiffany climbed into the passenger seat of the Cadillac, and Glee got behind the wheel, and then a couple of minutes later, they began their drive back home. It would take them 3 hours to complete the drive, but they made a pit stop about halfway through and grabbed some food at a fast food restaurant called Foster's Freeze, which was Tiffany's favorite place to get a milkshake. Finally, at about 5 p.m., Glee and Tiffany pulled into the driveway of their large ranch-style house in a secluded, wealthy neighborhood in Fresno. The house had a sprawling front yard that was beautifully landscaped with huge trees and a stone fountain in the center of the yard. Glee opened the garage door and pulled the Cadillac inside. Dale's car wasn't there, but that didn't surprise her. Even though the flight Dale had made was short, Glee knew he would spend some time at the airport making sure everything was all right with his plane. Tiffany got out of the car. She was carrying her drink from Foster's Freeze. Glee went around to the back seat, grabbed the cooler, and then followed Tiffany into their house. Once they were inside, Glee stopped to put the cooler down, but Tiffany kept on walking, and she disappeared down a hallway that led to the kitchen. Then, Glee thought that she heard something fall onto the floor down the hall, so she called out to Tiffany, but Tiffany didn't call back. So Glee walked into the hallway where Tiffany had just been, and when she did, she screamed, turned around, and started running. That night, Dana sat at the dinner table with his girlfriend Monica and her parents at Monica's parents' house. They had just finished a large Easter dinner, and Dana thanked Monica's parents for letting him spend the holiday with them. Then, not long after that, Dana and Monica drove back to their college campus in Dana's car. When they got to Dana's dorm room, he called home, but nobody answered. Dana thought it was odd that they were not picking up because he figured by now his family would be back from the beach, but Monica told him that they might have gone out for Easter dinner, or maybe they had all been worn out from the trip and just went straight to bed. But the following afternoon, Dana called home again after his classes, and there still was not any answer. So Dana called his father's office. And his father's assistant said that Dale had not checked in with her that day, but she thought it was possible that maybe Dale was just taking another day off after Easter. Dana said it seemed really strange to him that his dad had not even called the office to let her know. Dana finally hung up the phone, and then he went to find Monica in her dorm room. And as soon as Monica saw him, she knew something was wrong. Dana was pacing back and forth, and he had a really worried look on his face. Monica asked what was going on, and he told her that he still couldn't get a hold of his parents or his sister. Monica stood up and walked over to him and put her hands on his shoulders and tried to get him to calm down. And she said if he was really worried, he could totally call her dad because he was an FBI agent and he would know what to do. Dana said he really was worried, so Monica did call her father and then handed the phone over to Dana. Dana thanked Monica's dad for talking with him, and then he told him what was going on with his family. And Monica's dad pretty much immediately urged Dana to just stay calm, and then he also told Dana that, he would be happy to look around on his end to see if he could learn anything about what was going on with them. Later that day, Monica's dad would call Dana back, and even though he didn't have much information, what he did know was the Ewell's home security alarm company had not gotten any indication that the alarm had gone off or that anything out of the ordinary had occurred at the house. After hearing this, Dana did feel a bit more relaxed, and Monica would say to him that, probably he just missed his family at the house when he had called. Dana figured she was right, and he told her that he would just try to get a hold of them in the morning if they still had not contacted him by then. The next day at 9 a.m., so this was April 21st, 2 days after Glee and her daughter Tiffany had gotten back to their home in Fresno, the Ewell's housekeeper walked up to their front door, unlocked it with a key that she had, and she went inside. She was surprised that the alarm didn't beep when she walked in. The family was usually gone when she was there, and they almost always set the alarm when they left. So the housekeeper called out for Glee to see if she was home, but nobody responded. Then the housekeeper walked through the foyer into the living room that had high vaulted ceilings, and she got scared. Cushions from the couch were on the floor and pictures had been pulled off the wall. The housekeeper called out to Glee again, but still nobody responded. And so the housekeeper took a breath and tried to calm her nerves, but when she walked into the hallway that led to the kitchen, she immediately screamed and ran back through the house out the front door, and when she got out there, she just happened to see a man walking towards her, and she began screaming out at him. The man tried to figure out what was going on. He would say that he was the Ewell's neighbor and that their son, Dana, had called him that morning because Dana was worried about his parents. The housekeeper just shook her head, started to cry, and pointed to the Ewell's front door. The neighbor would go inside, and he would see the house was a total mess. Then he too stepped into the hallway, and immediately he ran to the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes after that 911 call, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet morning in the Ewell's wealthy Fresno neighborhood. Lead investigator John Souza of the Fresno County Sheriff's Department parked his car in front of the Ewell's house and stepped outside. It was a warm spring day, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Souza was short with dark hair and a thick mustache, and it was bright out, so he had his sunglasses on. From behind his glasses, he could see that the police sirens had already attracted a crowd. People up and down the street were now standing on their lawns, just staring over at the Ewell's house, wondering what was going on. Detective Souza saw the Ewell's housekeeper and their neighbor, who had called 911, standing outside. The housekeeper was inconsolable, and the neighbor looked like he was still in shock. So Souza walked up to them and tried to calm them down and told them everything was okay now, and then at some point, the neighbor told Souza what he had seen inside of the Ewell's house. Another squad car pulled up, and Deputy Chris Curtis got out. He was young and tall with light brown hair. Souza asked the neighbor and the housekeeper to please wait outside, and he told them that other officers would arrive soon to ask them more questions. Then Souza took off his sunglasses and waved Deputy Curtis over to him, and then the two of them walked into the Ewell's house together. Every room Souza and Curtis walked through inside of the house looked like it had been totally ransacked. Souza had spent his early days in law enforcement in the robbery unit, and he told Curtis that in all his time investigating robberies, he'd never seen a house in this state. It was like whoever had done this had opened and emptied virtually every cabinet and drawer and littered the floor with everything the Ewells owned. Then Sousa and Curtis walked down the hall towards the kitchen, and they found the first body. Dale was lying face down, dead in the hallway. A pool of dried blood had formed under his face, and several unopened newspapers were scattered across the floor. Sousa thought it looked like rigor mortis had already started to set in on the body. Rigor mortis is when muscles in a body stiffen after death, and so Sousa wondered if Dale had been dead for days. Sousa and Curtis walked further down the hall, they came to the kitchen, and they stopped again, because on the kitchen floor, they saw Tiffany lying face down like her father. Blood had run across the kitchen floor, and a drink had spilled nearby. Then they went back into the hall, walked into a home office, and found the third body. Glee was lying on her side, and massive amounts of blood had pooled behind her. Not long after Sousa and Curtis found Glee, the forensics team arrived and started looking for evidence on and around the bodies. And while they did that, Sousa and Curtis searched the rest of the house. The door to the main bedroom was open, and Sousa could see that the bedroom looked even more torn apart than the rest of the house. He and Curtis walked into the room and saw that every drawer of a large wooden dresser had been opened, and clothes were all over the floor. Sousa walked over to a vanity table and saw an open jewelry box that had been emptied. It seemed clear that whoever had killed the Ewells had also stolen valuable items from this jewelry box. So Sousa thought there was a chance this was just a robbery gone wrong, that the Ewells had just come home at the worst time, and when they walked in on the robbers panicked and killed them all. After doing an initial search of the house, Sousa and Curtis joined the forensics team near Dale's body. Forensics officers had found Dale's wallet nearby, but it had been cleaned out, and that supported the idea that robbery could have been the motive behind these killings. But then, forensics officers told Sousa something that he was not expecting to hear. Based on the wounds on the bodies, they believed the Ewells had been shot with a semi-automatic 9mm pistol. But there was no murder weapon, and not a single bullet casing had been left behind. And they said the weapon used and the way in which the victims were killed was like something they had seen in professional hits carried out by drug cartels. They also told Sousa that they found small yellow fibers on all three bodies, but they'd have to run tests on these fibers to know what they were. Sousa didn't know what to make of any of that. On the surface, nothing about the Ewells led him to believe they were mixed up in drug smuggling or some criminal enterprise. But Sousa knew enough not to rule anything out. So, as more members of his investigative team arrived, Sousa sent them out to interview the Ewells' neighbors. Then, Sousa got word from his boss that Dana Ewell was on his way to the sheriff's station with an FBI agent, and Sousa needed to go see them. At around noon, so 3 hours after the bodies had been discovered, Dana sat with his girlfriend Monica and her father, the FBI agent, in a small office in the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. Dana had called his parents' neighbor to ask him to check on the house. After the neighbor found the bodies and called 911, he had called Dana back and told Dana he needed to come home right now. But when Dana asked what was going on, the neighbor just kept saying over and over that he just needed to come home. Right after that, Dana had found Monica, and they called Monica's dad, the FBI agent. Dana said he knew something had to be really wrong, even if the neighbor wouldn't say what it was. And so using his law enforcement contacts, Monica's dad found out what had happened, and he had called ahead to the Fresno Sheriff's Department to let them know that he and Dana would be there soon. Then Dana, Monica, and her dad had flown to Fresno and headed right to the Sheriff's Department. In the office, Monica held Dana's hand tight. Dana hadn't heard all of the details, but he knew his parents and his sister were dead. Detective Sousa and Deputy Curtis walked into the office, fresh from the crime scene. Sousa told Dana right away how sorry he was about what had happened. In a quiet voice, Dana asked if there was anything he could do to help. And Sousa said, well, I know your father was a wealthy businessman. Do you know if maybe he had any enemies in the corporate world? Dana looked up in surprise, and then looked at his girlfriend, and then over at her father, and then he looked up at Sousa and said as far as he knew, his dad did not have any enemies. They talked a while longer, and anytime Dana had questions about the investigation process, he would look to Monica's dad for help. Monica's dad and Sousa both explained that it could take a while to figure out exactly what had happened. So Dana said he would stay with his uncle, who lived close by, in case the police needed anything else from him. Sousa thanked them all for coming in and said he'd be in touch soon. But the following day, Dana would reach out to Sousa and he would tell him that he really needed to speak to the police again. And when Sousa and Dana met for the second time in that same small office at the sheriff's department, Dana said he had not been completely honest the day before because he did not want to upset his girlfriend or his girlfriend's father. Sousa was a little thrown off by this, but he said he understood, and then he asked Dana to tell him anything that might help police in their investigation. Dana told Sousa that his father, Dale, did have one enemy that he was aware of, and his name was Frank Lamb, the man who had mentored his father and who had owned the airplane business before handing it over to Dale. Detective Sousa thanked Dana for coming back in and for being honest with him. And later that day, Sousa discovered that Frank Lamb had not just walked away from his company in the 1970s and sold it to Dale. It turned out Frank had been busted in a federal drug trafficking case, and when he got sent to prison for 3 years, Dale had swooped in and taken the company out from under him. A few days after the murder, Sousa and Curtis went to meet Frank at his house. Frank, who was very soft-spoken and polite, quickly welcomed the investigators inside. Frank said he'd read about the deaths of Dale and his family, and regardless of whatever bad blood had existed between them, Frank was sad to hear about what had happened. Sousa and Curtis pressed Frank about his connection to known drug smugglers that had landed him in prison back in the 1970s. Frank said he had no connection to any drug runners and that he had nothing to do with Dale's murder. Then he smiled at Sousa and said, Dale was very selfish and a very hard guy to work with, so I wouldn't be surprised if Dale had made a lot of people angry over his career. Sousa and Curtis left Frank's house with not much more to go on than what they had arrived with. Sousa didn't necessarily trust Frank, but the idea that Frank had waited 20 years to exact some kind of revenge on Dale didn't seem right to Sousa. Still, there were details at the crime scene that made it look like the murders could have been carried out by a hitman from a drug cartel. So Sousa didn't want to totally dismiss Frank as a suspect. But later that week, Sousa and Curtis made a discovery that seemed even more bizarre than the idea that the Ewells were connected to a drug smuggling operation. They found out that Glee had once worked for the CIA. Sousa reached out to the CIA, but the CIA was not forthcoming with many details. All Sousa learned was that Glee had been a Spanish translator in South America for the CIA over 30 years earlier. So all of a sudden, Sousa and his team wondered if Glee had been the target, and if the murders were somehow retribution for something she'd been involved in during her time in the agency. And that information about Glee's past somehow got out, and the media jumped all over it. Pretty soon, there were tabloid-style stories about the murdered millionaires with possible connections to international drug cartels and the CIA. With all this media attention, the spotlight got even brighter on the Fresno Sheriff's Department, and Dana and other members of the Ewell family and some friends started to publicly question if Sousa and his team were really up to the task here. Dana got so frustrated with the lack of progress and the crazy rumors swirling around about his family that he publicly compared Sousa and Curtis to Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street, the kids show. Dana thought these two would never find the person who had killed his parents and his sister. Sousa and his team tried to block out the noise and just stay focused on their investigation. And as they continued to turn over all the evidence in front of them, they realized that despite the possible links to drug cartels and the CIA, Sousa came to believe that the case might be a lot simpler than that. The Ewells were rich, and their house had been ransacked. But all the families in their neighborhood were rich too, and no other homes had been hit. So Sousa wanted to focus on people who would have known how wealthy the Ewells were and who had a direct connection to them. But when Sousa and his team shifted their investigation in this direction, it became clear that anyone who went to school with Dana would have known about his family's money. Because not only did Dana walk around campus in expensive Armani suits, but his college newspaper had also done a story about him. And in that story, Dana had talked a lot about the success of his father's business and his family's wealth. So Souza and his team reached out to some of Dana's friends at Santa Clara University, and a few of them said there was one person who police really needed to talk to, a recent graduate named Joel Radovich. They all said Joel was a loner and kind of a strange guy, and that he had always seemed a little obsessed with Dana. On May 8th, almost 3 weeks after the murders, Souza drove 2.5 hours from Fresno to Santa Clara to meet Joel Radovich. And when Souza had talked to Joel on the phone to arrange this meeting, he just got an odd feeling about him. Joel said he did not want police to come to his mother's house, so he would go to the motel where Souza was going to be staying. But that wasn't really what had grabbed Souza's attention. Before Souza had hung up, Joel asked him if he was going to be arrested. Souza had told Joel that, "No, I really just want to talk to you," but Souza did think it was very odd that someone would jump to the conclusion that they were being arrested right off the bat. Outside the motel, Souza saw Joel pull into the parking lot in his black Honda CRX car. Joel got out of the car and began walking over to Souza. Joel was 22 years old with bleached blonde hair. He wore a baggy long-sleeve shirt and baggy jeans. Souza introduced himself and then led Joel to a small motel room, and then they both sat down at a table that was pushed up against the wall. And before Souza could even ask a question, Joel asked again if he was going to be arrested. A look of surprise came across Souza's face, and he asked why Joel was so worried about that. Joel said that he'd actually been arrested years earlier for stealing furniture from a dorm at Santa Clara University, and since then, he said the Santa Clara police were always harassing him. Souza told Joel that he didn't have anything to do with the Santa Clara police or the stolen furniture. But Souza made a note that Joel had just admitted to having committed a robbery in the past. Souza asked Joel how he knew Dana. Joel said they had met in the dorm and hung out a few times, but that was really it. Joel was a couple of years ahead of Dana in college, so they weren't really close, and Joel said he had not kept in touch with Dana, or really anybody from school, since he had graduated a year earlier. Then Souza asked Joel where he had been on Easter Sunday. Joel immediately looked up at the ceiling like he was trying to remember something, and then he looked down and he said that he'd actually been at a paint and body shop getting some work done on his car. After chatting for a bit longer, Souza finally smiled and thanked Joel for driving all this way out to the motel to meet him, and then Joel got up and walked out of the motel. But right after Joel was gone, Souza got in touch with members of his team. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he thought Joel was hiding something. He wasn't sure the kid was a killer, but he was almost positive Joel knew more than he was saying. So Souza wanted to learn as much about him as he could. It would take months for the sheriff's department to get everything in place, but eventually they got clearance to conduct full-time surveillance on Joel. And what police learned from that surveillance operation and from digging deeper into Joel's life convinced Souza the investigation was on the right track. But Souza's process was methodical and slow, and months went by without any new information getting out to the public. So Dana and other people on the outside thought the cops just weren't doing anything. And as the investigation stretched into months and then years, even Monica's dad, the FBI agent, questioned the Fresno Sheriff's Department's techniques. But Souza, Curtis, and the rest of the team just kept blocking out the public attacks. They were confident they had the killer in their sights, but they wanted to make sure their case was airtight before they moved in. In early March of 1995, almost 3 years after the murders, Souza, Curtis, and local police officers approached a TGI Fridays restaurant in a town just outside of Los Angeles. Souza went around back to where he had a car waiting, and Curtis and the others headed inside. The music was loud inside, and the place was packed, and Curtis was surprised this was where the investigation had finally led. But he and Souza were sure that the bartender working at Fridays that night was the one person who could bring the Yule murder case to a close. Curtis weaved around a few tables and moved out of the way of the server, but he never took his eyes off the bartender. And the bartender eventually looked up and saw Curtis coming his way. The bartender immediately began scanning around the room like he was looking for his exit, but he could tell there was just no way he could make a run for it. So Curtis and the other cops walked up to the bartender and told him they needed to talk. The bartender got a look on his face like he knew he'd been caught. Then police led him out through the kitchen to a parking lot behind the restaurant, and they put him in the car where Souza was waiting for him. And when Souza was done talking to this bartender, police would finally know who had killed Dale, Glee, and Tiffany, and how they had done it. Based on information provided by the bartender, evidence found at the murder scene, and details from interviews carried out during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the day someone murdered the Ewell family on April 19, 1992. On the night of April 18th, so the day before the murders, the killer watched steam rise from their shower. While the hot water ran, the killer stepped into the shower and covered their body in shaving cream. Then they reached down with their right hand, grabbed a disposable razor from the side of the shower, and ran the blade over the hair on their left forearm. A few minutes later, they rinsed the razor off under the hot water, they bent down, and started shaving the hair on their left leg. The process took a long time, but eventually the killer had removed all of their body hair except for their eyebrows and the hair on their head. After they were done, they stepped out of the shower and dried off. Before sunrise on April 19th, the following morning, the killer got dressed in all black, wore a knit hat to cover the hair on their head, and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The killer walked outside and put a large backpack as well as an unloaded semi-automatic 9mm gun in the back seat of the car. Then the killer drove to the Ewell's neighborhood. When they arrived, they drove past the Ewell's house and parked their car a few blocks away. They grabbed the backpack and the gun, got out of the car, closed the door, and moved quickly through the darkness to the Ewell's house. Once the killer got there, they walked around to the backyard that was surrounded by a low cinder block fence. They dropped their bag and the gun into the backyard, and then climbed over the fence, they grabbed their things, and then ran to a small shed in the backyard and stepped inside. The killer had studied everything about the house, and they knew there was a spare key on the floor of the shed. So they pulled a flashlight out of their bag, they found the key, they grabbed it, and then darted across the yard towards the back door. The killer unlocked the door and walked inside. The house was dark, but the killer found their way to Dale and Glee's bedroom. They turned on the light, opened their backpack, and pulled out a large plastic sheet and unrolled the sheet across the floor. Then the killer put their gun down on the plastic sheet. They walked across the room to a jewelry box, they emptied it and put the stolen jewelry in their backpack. The killer then sat down on the plastic sheet, they reached into their backpack again and pulled out ammunition as well as a homemade silencer made with PVC pipe and several tennis balls that had been cut in half. The killer loaded their gun and attached the homemade silencer to it. Then they sat there on the plastic sheet and waited patiently for someone to come home. Several hours later, at about 5 p.m., the killer heard the garage door open. The killer felt butterflies in their stomach and a jolt of nervous energy. They grabbed their gun, they ran down the hall, and crouched down in a room that was across from the kitchen. The killer could hear a door open and then also Glee and Tiffany talking. The killer tried to control their breath and told themselves to stay calm and just wait for the right moment. Then, Tiffany walked past the killer in the hall and went into the kitchen. The killer immediately sprung up from their hiding spot, walked down the hall after her, and then pointed the gun into the kitchen and fired. The bullet hit Tiffany in the back of the head. Tiffany's drink flew from her hand, blood splashed onto the walls and floor, and she fell face down. Tiffany had died almost instantly. The killer heard Glee say something from another room, so they spun around in the hall. Then Glee came around the corner and saw the killer. Glee screamed, she turned and started to run away, but the killer fired off 3 shots in her direction, and Glee stumbled into the office nearby. The killer ran down the hall to the office and saw Glee lying on her side and bleeding, but she was still breathing, so the killer aimed and shot Glee just below the eye. The killer was breathing fast now. They walked away from Glee's body and went to hide in the room near the kitchen, where they tried to calm down and got ready to wait some more. About 30 minutes later, the killer heard the garage door open again. The sound of the door had made them tense up, and so they stood and raised their gun and got ready for the next killing. The killer heard Dale walk into the house, and then when Dale walked down that hallway right past the killer stepped out of their hiding place, raised their gun, and shot Dale in the back of the neck. Dale immediately crumpled to the floor, and newspapers he'd picked up from the front yard scattered all around him. Dale died in the hallway before ever seeing the bodies of his wife and daughter. The killer walked forward, kneeled down, and got a close look at Dale to make sure he really was dead. Satisfied, the killer grabbed Dale's wallet out of his pants pocket, slipped Dale's cash and credit cards into their own pockets, and then dropped the wallet back on the floor. Then the killer rushed through the house, emptying drawers and cabinets, knocking stuff off of tables, and trying to make the scene look like a random burglary as much as possible. Then the killer ran to the main bedroom, rolled up their plastic sheet, and put it in their backpack. Then they walked out of the house through the backyard, put the key back where they had found it in the shed, and climbed over the fence away from the property. The killer did their best to move fast through the neighborhood without drawing any attention to themselves. They made it back to their car, they hopped in, and they sped away. A few minutes later, they pulled onto the highway and left Fresno behind. When they finally made it home, they sat down in their bed and waited for the phone to ring, because they knew Dana Ewell would be in touch soon. Joel Radovich, the young man Souza had never trusted, murdered Dale, Glee, and Tiffany. But Joel had carried these murders out at Dana Ewell's request. It would turn out that despite what Joel had told Souza, he and Dana were close friends. In fact, some people said they were almost inseparable. And according to some of their classmates, Dana and Joel seemed to lack any sense of morality. They had convinced themselves there was no difference between right and wrong, and so any action, even murder, could be justified. And Dana wanted to murder his parents and his sister because with all of them gone, he would inherit $8 million and his father's company. Dana didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps, he wanted to replace his father. In fact, in the story Dana's college newspaper had written about him, Dana claimed to be the brains behind his father's successful airplane business, and he even implied he was running the company while going to college. So Dana had offered Joel $4 million of the inheritance he was sure to get if Joel would kill his family. Dana had given Joel a layout of the house and said he would leave a key in the shed for him and told him how to disable the alarm system. Joel had accepted the deal. Then he bought a book called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, to help him plan the perfect murders. The book had led Joel to shave off all of his body hair so he wouldn't leave any hair behind at the crime scene, which could then be used as DNA evidence. And the book suggested using a gun and a homemade silencer that could not be traced back to the shooter. But Joel needed help with that part of the plan, so he had turned to his good friend, the TGI Fridays bartender, who was an avid gun collector. The bartender had given Joel a semi-automatic 9mm, and he had helped Joel build the silencer. The tennis balls used in the silencer had left these strange yellow fibers on all the bodies. Then, after the murders, the bartender got the gun back, broke it apart, and buried the pieces in different places. And while that was all happening, Dana Ewell had called his father's office, and he had talked to his girlfriend's FBI agent father, all to throw off suspicion and to make people believe he, the son, was truly worried about his family and wanted justice for them. And Dana's tactics had worked for a little while, because it turned out that Souza was almost positive Joel Radovich had murdered the Ewells not long after they had met in the motel. But it took some serious digging before the investigators became convinced that Dana Ewell was the person behind his family's murder. And putting all the pieces together and getting an airtight case against Dana took a long time. But finally, surveillance on Joel had led police to the TGI Fridays bartender, and after they cornered him at work, the bartender told police he knew everything about the murders and he admitted his part in them. Then he led police to the place where he had buried the barrel of the gun that was used in the murders, and he agreed to testify against Joel and Dana in court. The bartender was ultimately granted immunity for his testimony, and as of 2023, he works as an attorney in California. As for Joel and Dana, they were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany are all buried next to each other in Fresno. The epitaph on all 3 of their headstones reads, "Together Forever." In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his 2 daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So Frank's wife and the girl's mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible, but what made it even worse is that, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household. And so as soon as she passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job, again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these 2 poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, you gotta remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. They can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, putting themselves to bed, they start talking about how, man, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there is a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a game board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a planchette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer, that you can place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the planchette. And they will literally just say things like, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, the spirits will move the planchette around so that people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it. And it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board. They go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers on the planchette. And after a minute, one of the girls is like, hey, Mom, are you here with us right now? And they have their fingers on the planchette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute, and they try again. Mom, if you're here with us right now, please, anything, just move it even a little bit. Show us you're here with us right now. Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question they can possibly think of to try to elicit a response from their mother, who they so want to believe is like with them right now, sort of looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they asked these questions, the planchette never moved. So the seance didn't work. And so the girls, it's not clear if they literally believed they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom. But, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, mom really is gone. And so they packed up their Ouija board, very frustrated, and they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house. They climb into bed, and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work. He won't be home for some time, and the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep. And so they're laying in their bedrooms. It's totally dark. It's quiet. And as they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But, at first, the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. It just sort of sounded like, house sounds at night. The sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what. But they seemed sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, it wasn't really consistent tapping sound. It was more sporadic, but it was consistently sporadic. Like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. As that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering, like, what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out. And so she got out of her bed and she left her room. She goes down the hallway. She comes into Tina's bedroom and
And she goes up to her big sister and she's like, "Do you hear that tapping sound?" And Tina's like, "Yeah, what is that?" And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together. They go out into the hallway. They can still hear the tapping. It's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere. And the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor. They can only see, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there. And the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. And at some point, one of the girls says, "Wait a minute. What if this tapping sound is Mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her?" And so feeling sort of excited all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, "Mom, is that you down there?" And immediately there's a response. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question. And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom. And so after getting that tap, tap, tap response, one of the girls asks another question. "Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you." Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs. And the girls 100% believe it's their mother. And again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom. And even though some of their questions weren't really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response. Like, again, something is interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor, and they're hearing this tapping, and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. And they open up the basement door, and they're asking more questions. They're getting those tap responses, and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be Mom, they weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement to follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be Mom, but it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stayed there right above the stairs, looking into the basement, just constantly asking questions and getting responses from down in the basement from Mom. It was great. And eventually, after, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping just stopped. The girls continued asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside and he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is, he's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, "Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had this seance and we heard this tapping sound and we know it was Mom. Mom is with us right now. We were talking to her." Now, Frank, he's totally caught off guard by what they're saying, but he also knows his girls, they're going through this horrible time in their lives. They've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. He's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited, and they're telling him that tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all this stuff, he just goes, "You know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She will always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house, I'm sure of it." And so the girls, they're so happy. Again, this was such an amazing experience. Their dad, he also agreed this is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms, then they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it. Again, he's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. And he thinks, you know what? It's healthy enough. It's making them happy. What's the big deal? So Frank, he goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue, and they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen. They were coming sometimes from the second floor. They were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over, but Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all, but he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy, clearly this is their coping mechanism. And so again, Frank's not thinking much of it. It's harmless. The girls are frustrated that he can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is mom. This is positive. This was definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping. Because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets, and it was frightening. And they would call their dad in and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's mom anymore. They don't know what this is. And it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. Like, it's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls, like, hey, come on, guys, there's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. Like, there's nothing that's going to harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here looking out for you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You got to let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, like, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit. And now that evil spirit is haunting our house. And so Frank, at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. Like, these tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds and Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so fast forward about a week after the seance, and now the girls really are so scared to be in their house because of this tapping, which they believe is now this evil spirit in their house. They're finding all sorts of excuses to just stay out of their house. Like when dad's at work late, they're trying to stay at their friend's house and not be home because it was too frightening. And Frank, he's sort of at his wit's end with what to do with his girls, because now this thing that's going on in the house, this delusion as he believed it was, that his girls were suffering from, it was really disruptive and unhealthy. And he began telling his girls, like, if you can't stop with this whole tapping delusion, you're going to have to go to grief counseling. Like, this is too much. And so, again, fast forward about a week here, and that's what's going on in the Bowen household. And on this particular day, the girls, Tina and Karen, they didn't have a place to go that night. They didn't have a friend who was available. And so they're home at their house alone. Frank's out for the night doing a late night shift. And the girls, they're in their kitchen just kind of hanging out. They're pretty anxious here. And they start to hear tapping sounds coming from the basement. Now, by this point, the tapping sounds were so common that just hearing the tapping sounds was not like this horribly frightening thing. It was just sort of this very unsettling thing where nobody knew what they were. And again, the girls think it's something evil. But on this night that the girls are alone, dad's gone, Tina, the older of the two, she says to Karen, like, Dad doesn't believe us. He does not believe that there's tapping sounds in the house. And so we, right now, need to go down in the basement and investigate. Because if we don't, no one's ever going to look into this. Like, nobody believes us. And Karen is horrified at the idea, Karen's the 9-year-old, of going down into the basement, to go see what this tapping is, but she doesn't want to be away from her sister, and so she's like, okay. And so Tina gets a knife from the kitchen, she goes to the door to the basement, Karen follows right behind her, and Tina, she opens up the door, and the two girls begin going down the steps. And once they get to the bottom of the steps and they're in the basement, it's just this kind of blank slate down there. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's some boxes, but it's just sort of a dank, sort of open, nothing cellar down there. And the girls, when they got down there, they're looking for the origin of this tapping sound. And on some level, they expected to find something that was making these sounds because they've been hearing these sounds. For them, it's not a delusion. Like every time they hear these sounds, they are real to them. Just because their dad doesn't hear it does not mean it's not real to them. And if you look at the beginning, when they first started hearing the sounds, they thought it was their mom. And they never really fully investigated. They maybe didn't want to find out that, perhaps the tapping sound was a washing machine or something, because that would destroy the illusion that it was their mom. So they never fully investigated then, and then the next few days after that, when it sort of transitioned and became a scary thing, the girls also never really investigated because it was scary now. They didn't want to know what was making this tapping sound. And so now here we are a week into this, and they've gone down into the basement where they've heard the tapping sounds, and they're like prepared to see something that is making this sound because it's real for them. Like maybe it's a raccoon or some animal that's gotten into their house. There has to be something because they hear these sounds. But now they're looking around this basement and there's nothing. There's nothing that could possibly be making this sound, and the girls are horrified. And so after being down there only for a couple of minutes, Tina, who's got the kitchen knife, she's like, Karen, let's get out of here. Like, this isn't right. Let's get out of here. And so the girls turn around and they begin going back up the steps. And as they do, they notice something on the stairway wall that they didn't see on the way down. Written in red on the wall are the words, "I'm in your closet, come find me." And when the girls see that, they are horrified. And they sprint up the stairs, they bolt out of their house, they go to their neighbor's house, start banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbor comes to the door and he's like, "What's going on?" And the girls are like, "Oh my God, we had this seance, we've been hearing tapping in the walls, and now somebody's written on the walls, we don't know what's going on." And the neighbor is so confused, really doesn't understand what's happening. And he's like, "Look, girls, just come into my house, you're safe here, we'll wait for your dad to come home, he'll know what to do." And so the girls, they're hysterical, they go into the neighbor's house, they shut the door, and they wait. And then a little bit later, Frank Bowen, their dad, he comes home. The neighbor immediately flags him down and calls him over. And he's like, "Look, here's what happened. Your girls came over. They said, something about writing on the walls. I don't know." And Frank's like, "Okay, all right." And he tells his girls, like, "Look, stay here. You're safe here. I'll go check the house and make sure nobody's in there." Frank at this point in no way suspects that there's anything, evil or bad in his house. He thinks this is just a continuation of this delusion the girls are sort of acting out. And so Frank, alone, goes back to his house. He opens up the door, he goes inside, he searches the house, and he looks everywhere, but there's nobody in the house. He does find the writing in the stairwell going down to the basement. It does say, "I'm in your closet, come find me," but it's written in ketchup. And so after, again, searching the whole house and finding nothing other than this writing, Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and he talks to his girls, and he's not mad at them. In some ways, he feels like all of this is basically his fault. Like, he should have handled this more aggressively at the beginning, and he let it get to this point. And so he tells his girls, like, "Look, I know that you wrote those words on the wall. I know that all of this is sort of a delusion that's playing out that started with, something good. You thought it was mom, but now it's become something that isn't good. It's disruptive. You've convinced yourself the house is haunted. And I'm very worried that this is a product of grief. Like, grief is leading you to do these things, and it needs to stop. And so starting tomorrow, you're going to go into grief counseling. We need professional help here to make sure you girls are taken care of. I should have done this from the beginning, so we're going to make that happen right now." Now, the girls knew they didn't write that on the wall. They're not making the tapping sounds, but they also knew their dad 100% didn't believe them, like zero, and it was not going to change. And on some level, they think maybe there's truth to what he's saying. Maybe they are so grief-stricken that they've convinced themselves of things that are not real. And so in this sort of vulnerable moment where the girls are totally upset about what they've seen and what they've heard, they just tell their dad, "Fine, whatever, we'll go to grief counseling." And so sure enough, the next day, the girls would start grief counseling, and right away, all the tapping in the house, all the writing on the walls, all that stuff stopped. Peace returned to the Bowen household, at least at first. Fast forward 3 weeks to December 8th, 1986. So this is 3 weeks after the girls began their therapy, and in those 3 weeks, the Bowen household is totally calm, there's no more tapping, nothing, everything is fine. But on December 8th, Frank, along with his two girls, Tina and Karen, and their friend, Kathleen, They had been out for the evening, maybe getting ice cream or going out to eat or whatever, and they come back to the Bowen household. And when they do, it's nighttime, so it's dark outside, and Frank, he goes up to the porch, he goes to the front door, and as he's about to open up the door, he looks through one of the windows of his house, and he sees there are several lights on in the house that he didn't remember leaving on before they left. And so he just thinks, like, that's weird. Like, I could have sworn I turned those lights off. He's kind of looking back at the girls right behind him, sort of wondering if maybe they left the lights on, but he's like, oh, that's weird. So he unlocks the front door, he swings the door open, and immediately he sees this scene inside of his house that makes no sense. The TV is on, a radio is on, and furniture in the first floor of the house where he's looking has clearly been moved. Not dramatically, but things have been moved around on the first floor. Like if you live somewhere, you know where things go. Things are off. And Frank, like he's seeing this, and he's sort of looking back at Tina and Karen. He's like, did they do this? Are we back to this whole delusion? You gotta remember that even though it's been 3 weeks now of peace in the Bowen household, Frank is all too aware of how insane it was right before then. With the girls, writing on the wall, at least according to him, and thinking there was an evil spirit in their house. And, he's thinking, is this them? Like, somehow did they do this? This feels sort of like a continuation of that. And he's looking at the girls, but he's thinking to himself, like, they've been with me. We've been out of the house. How could they do this? But again, Frank is sort of caught. On the one hand, he knows this could be his girls, but he's also thinking that's not possible. And so in that mind state of sort of being caught between these two opposing ideas, Frank, instead of backing out of the house and calling the police like anybody else would do, he instead just begins like walking into the house, sort of nonchalant, like not really sure how to react. And he begins this sort of half-cocked search through the house. And the whole time, Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, they see what's going on, and the two daughters, they're terrified. I mean, they're all too aware of all the tapping and the writing on the walls. They're thinking, this is real, it's happening again. And so they're tucked up right behind Frank, who again, Frank is like in shock. He's just like wandering through the house, like, what's going on here? Turns the TV off, he's walking around, turns the radio off, he's moving furniture back around, and he can't believe it. And so he does this weird, like again, half-invested search through the first floor. He doesn't find anybody there. He goes to the second floor, does the same search. Again, all three girls, the two daughters and the friend, they're right behind Frank because they're so scared. They do the search of the second floor, nobody there. They search the attic, nobody there either. They go down to the basement, nobody in the basement, like there's nobody in the house. And so Frank is like, what is going on here? And then he remembers there's actually a room on the first floor of the house that he forgot to search. It was just a front room of the house right off the front entrance. When he began the search, he just sort of overlooked it because he was sort of in a daze. And so he's like, okay, I'll go back up there and I'll search that last room and then I'll know the whole house is secure. Nobody's here. And so Frank goes back up the basement stairs to the first floor. The girls are tucked up right behind him, still so scared. And he makes his way towards this room, and this room overlooks the front of the property. There are windows looking out to the road. It's just you walk in, there's windows, there's the front of the house, and there's a little closet over to the left. It's like a sitting room. And so Frank, he goes into this room, and right away, he sees on the wall right in front of him, written in shaving cream, are the words, "Marry me." And so Frank, he walks over to the words, and he's staring at them, being like, what is this? Like, who wrote this? The girls, again, are right behind him, tucked up against the back of his legs, and he's staring, and as he's doing that, he hears movement in the closet in the room that he's in. And Frank turns and he looks at this closet. The doors are open to this closet, but it's a dark closet. And out of the closet walks a man who was wearing a dress, Frank's dead wife's dress. This person had clown makeup on their face, and they were wielding a hatchet. And they walk out of the closet, and they look at Frank, and they look at the girls who are so shocked, they're just in silence staring back at the sky. And this person looks at Frank and goes, "You and the girls go upstairs." And so Frank immediately goes into protector mode, and he gets between the maniac and his girls, and he just tells the girls, like, go up the stairs, do what he says. And the hatchet-wielding maniac just sort of walks along, following after Frank and the girls. Again, Frank sort of staying between this person and the girls. And so Frank shepherds the girls up the stairs, and he's like, go ahead, girls, first bedroom, go in the first bedroom. So they go upstairs. All three girls go into the first bedroom. So Kathleen, Karen, Tina, and then Frank, he goes into the bedroom, and the maniac's right here in the hallway about to follow after Frank. And as soon as Frank gets in the door, Frank shuts the door and holds it shut, and there's suddenly this struggle between the maniac in the hallway and Frank. The maniac's trying to get in, there's this vicious struggle, and Tina, who's already in this bedroom, just turns, runs, and leaps out the second floor window. And so she smashes to the ground, she runs next door to that neighbor's house, she slams on the door, the neighbor comes out and Tina's screaming about, "There's someone in my house!" And so the neighbor at this point knows this is a real emergency. They call the police, and then minutes later, the police show up, and when they get there, they look up at the Bowen household, and Frank Bowen is leaning out of that second floor bedroom, and he's screaming to the police, "Hey, there's somebody in here. He was just at my door. He's gone. I don't know where he is." And police, they get over, they put a ladder up to the window. Frank comes down, they get the other two girls down, so everybody is safely out of the house now. They've been moved over to that neighbor's house, and now the police are going to go into the Bowen household to find this dress-wearing, hatchet-wielding, clown makeup-wearing maniac. They're going to find him and put him into custody. And so the police, they go into the Bowen household, guns drawn, and they search that entire property, top to bottom, and they find nothing. Nobody's there. The house is completely vacant. However, they would find a hatchet lying by the back sliding glass door, and the back sliding glass door was partially open. And so ultimately, again, when nobody is found inside the house, the police decide, well, clearly this maniac, if there really was a maniac, is now gone. Because look, the door's open, the hatchet's here, so they're gone. And so the police, they go over and talk to Frank and his family, and they're like, look, we don't really know what to make of this. We didn't actually see, this person you claim to have seen in your house. I'm sure there was somebody, but we didn't see them. And so for now, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor your property 24/7 and just see what happens, see if anybody comes in or out. We'll make sure nobody comes to this property, and we'll also begin an investigation in town to try to figure out, who this maniac was. And in the meantime, you and your girls go stay with a family friend or something. Just don't be here because we don't know what's going on here. And so Frank and his girls, they went and stayed with a family friend, and the police began their surveillance of the Bowen household. And for 2 days, nothing happened. Nobody went in or out of the Bowen household. And despite police canvassing the town and trying to figure out, who this maniac could have been, they really didn't get anywhere. Because remember, Frank's description and the girl's description of this maniac was, probably a man wearing a dress with clown makeup on. And so effectively, this person had a disguise on. There was nothing to go on. So they couldn't find anybody in town, there was no leads, and nobody has come to this house. And they're communicating with Frank Bowen the whole time. Basically, nothing's coming of this case. And so finally, 48 hours after, confronting this maniac in the closet, Frank and his girls, they've been at the family friend's house this whole time. And Frank's like, it'd be great to get my toiletries and a few other things from my house, because basically they evacuated their house and didn't get a chance to pack or anything. And Frank's thinking nothing's going on at the house. There's no leads in this case. It's got to be safe to go back to my house for a minute and get the things I need. And so he tells his girls to stay with his family friend, and Frank, by himself, goes over to his house, and it's broad daylight, and he's expecting to find a police officer, who's monitoring his property, and he can tell the officer, hey, I'm just going in real quick to get my stuff, and they would, let him go in and do that. But when he got to his house, he looked around, and he didn't see any police officer outside the property watching the property. And he's thinking, that's pretty weird. They told me they've been watching my property 24/7, where are they? But Frank's like, that's weird, whatever. So he gets out of his car and begins walking towards his front door. But as he's walking, for a second, out of the corner of his eye, he can swear he can see somebody moving in the second floor of his house. But when he looked up, nobody was there. But he was certain somebody had been moving around up there. And Frank's thinking to himself, wait a minute. Are the police monitoring my house from the inside? Is that what they're doing? They've been in my house? I could have sworn they said they were out of my house. And Frank's like, you know what, just in case, I need to call the police because I don't want to walk in there and startle an armed police officer who's basically looking for an intruder. And so Frank, he goes to that neighbor's house and uses their phone and he calls the police and he's like, hey, are you in my house? Is that what you guys have been doing? You've been monitoring my house from the inside? And they're like, no, we have been watching it from the outside. Very likely what's happened here is you've arrived at your house at the exact moment when there is turnover happening between the police officers who are watching it from the outside. Meaning the officer who's been watching your house must have just left, and the incoming officer who will be taking over the next shift is probably on their way, or maybe they're there right now. And in fact, what you should do, Frank, is hang up with us, go back to your property, and very likely the officer will be there or be there soon, and you can talk to them and have them search your house just in case to make sure nobody's in there. And so Frank says, okay, he hangs up the phone, he goes outside, and sure enough, now there is clearly a police officer in a car outside of his property. So Frank goes over and, explains the situation to the officer, and the officer's like, no one's going inside your property. Literally, we have watched this property 24/7, save for a couple of minutes here and there when we're doing turnover, but nobody's gone in or out of your property. But either way, Frank, I'll search your house just to be sure. And so Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and this officer goes up to Frank's door, he opens it up, he looks inside, and he can't believe what he's looking at. In the first floor of Frank's house, it's just madness. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor, and the furniture clearly has been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these sort of weird arrangements. And there are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and there are kitchen knives that have been driven into family photos on the wall. Like the knives are still sticking into the photo, and where these knives have been driven through the photo is always on a picture of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. And where there are knives in these pictures, above those pictures is written, "I'm going to kill you, Tina," or "I'm going to kill you, Karen." And so this officer obviously knows, we have a problem here. And so he backs out of the house, he calls for reinforcements, and so all these officers go in, guns drawn, now convinced, clearly somebody has found a way to come in and out of this house, or they're still here, and we have to find them. Like, clearly, the Bowens were not lying about this horrible, maniac that they encountered in the second floor of their house when police first showed up. Clearly, that must have happened, because they didn't do this, somebody else did, and they gotta be here. And so police, they tear the Bowen household apart, looking for this maniac. They look everywhere, and they can't find anybody. There's nobody in the house. And on top of that, it had snowed outside, and before they went in, they made sure they walked around the property to see if there were footsteps coming in or out of the property, and there wasn't. Like, it's not possible what they're seeing. But they've now torn the house up, looking for anything, and they found nothing. Other than, again, the madness they've seen with the furniture, the writing, the knives, that's all they've found. And so after hours and hours of this very frustrating search, a few of the officers found themselves in the basement, and they're just standing there talking to each other like, this is crazy. We must have missed something. Like, what is it? And at some point, one of those officers who was having that conversation, he had his hand resting on the washing machine, and he's just sitting there like, yeah, what did we miss? What did we miss? And suddenly, as he's leaning against the washing machine moved. And so suddenly there's this gap that's been created by moving the washing machine, and the officer looks at the wall where the machine had been sitting before, and clearly there is a hole on the wall. And the officer gets out his flashlight, and he looks in the wall and kind of scans down, and he sees there's this tunnel that's been burrowed in the wall of the basement, and it goes over to the corner, and looking back at this officer is Danny LaPlante. And he's crouched down, he's got a hatchet over his shoulder, he's wearing a dress, and he's staring back at this officer. I'm going to tell you about Danny LaPlante because this story takes a very dark turn. So, Danny LaPlante was 16 years old at the time he was pulled out of the wall. And 6 months prior to being pulled out of the Bowen household's wall, Danny had had this very brief interaction with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old. Apparently they went to school together or had some interaction in town, but Danny had sort of fallen in love or had some sort of romantic interest in Tina, and he felt like Tina had rejected him. Now, Tina did not remember any of this with Danny. This is entirely Danny's memory of what happened. But either way, 6 months earlier, when he had this sense of rejection from Tina, Danny responded to that by breaking into the Bowen household, cutting a hole in their walls, and burrowing tunnels in their walls. And for 6 months, Danny LaPlante lived in the Bowen household in their walls. Now, Danny was not able to access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could basically maneuver in the basement and partially into the first floor, but in order to get to the other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. And so routinely, over these 6 months that he was in their house, Danny would literally, while the family was home, just get out and wander through their house, like as the family is just living there, and they never noticed him. And so for 6 months, Danny spied on that family 24/7. And when the girls had that seance with the Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement in the walls watching, and he saw an opportunity. He thought, I'm going to pretend to be their mother and screw with them. And so when they heard that tapping sound, that was Danny pretending to be their mom. He was absolutely trying to get them to believe their mother was here. But then whenever Frank was around, Danny would stop the tapping and sort of let Frank believe the girls were making it up. And then gradually, Danny sort of transitioned from it's your mom and it's good to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night. He began sneaking out of the wall, going upstairs to the girls' bedroom, flicking the undersides of their beds, going in their closet, tapping in their closet, and then making sure to be hidden or escape before Frank came in. I mean, this is absolutely psychotic behavior, but it gets worse. So Danny is taken out of the walls and he's arrested, but then 10 months later, when he is awaiting trial, Danny is released on bail. And while he is on bail, he would sneak into another family's house in Massachusetts, the Gustafsons' house, and unfortunately, that family would not escape Danny. Danny would murder 3 members of that family for really no particular reason. He just picked a family and killed them. And so very likely, if Tina had not leapt out of the second floor window when Danny revealed himself in that dress with the hatchet and got them to go up to that bedroom, if Tina hadn't leapt out and if Frank hadn't held off the door like that, almost certainly Danny was corralling that family into that room to kill them with the hatchet. But Tina basically saved their lives. Danny LaPlante is still alive and he's serving multiple consecutive life sentences, and he actually recently was put up for parole. He didn't get it, he did not get parole, but during his hearing for his parole, when he was rejected, he was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates in the entire prison system.
We used to stay. Coffee shop lights still fade the same way. Then I see your shadow under neon rain, like all these months just disappeared again. You smile first, but your eyes look tired, like we both survived our own small fires. Funny how a stranger knows me best. Even after everything we left, we don't ask where the other's been. We don't touch, we just pretend. But silence says what words can't do. The past still lies between me and you. We once loved so deeply, now just a broken in-betweens, and our eyes already said goodbye. We stand there like a memory has.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events.